I'm Antonio Tijerino with the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, as well as a member of Ayuda's Advisory Council. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first installment of Faces of Change, which is brought to you by Ayuda, with some support from the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, with in-kind support from Immigrant Food, a fast casual restaurant that fuses delicious food and immigration advocacy. And I need to find out if they deliver. Ayuda is a legendary organization that provides legal, social, and language services to help low-income immigrants in our communities access justice and transform their lives. Since 1973, Ayuda has served more than 100,000 low-income immigrants throughout the Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia area. Ayuda's expert and dedicated professionals help immigrants from anywhere in the world navigate the immigration and justice systems and access a social safety net. Their comprehensive and welcoming approach breaks down barriers, helps those in need, and makes our community stronger. I remember being young and impressionable in DC in the 80s, and Ayuda left a tremendous impression on me. So to be able to partner with them is a privilege. And I want to clarify, late 80s, not early 80s, for all of you that are counting at home. Thank you, Paula, Laura, and the team at Ayuda. What you do is critical. My organization, the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, focuses on education, workforce development, leadership, and culture. Our virtual community charla series launched just as the COVID pandemic started its attack, not just on the country, but with a tragic focus on our Black and Latino familia. Our charlas have attracted thousands as we provide a safe space to share personal experiences, ideas, and actions through compelling and inspiring presentations on topics ranging from mental health, financial wellness, food insecurities, immigration, LGBTQ+, career paths, and racism, among many others. As we like to say, we need to listen up, speak up, and show up. You can use the hashtag #CommunityCharlas. Please note that on Friday, in 2 days, October 9th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, we're hosting a charla with Disney on the process of getting it right when telling our Latinx stories. And in this case, we're focusing on Disney's movie production of West Side Story by Steven Spielberg. So definitely check that out. Today's Faces of Change speaker series is kind of Ayuda's version of a charla and offers a set of conversations offering a space for informative and educational discourse on the impact of current events, cultural shifts, policy changes, and other issues affecting our communities. During this unprecedented time in our history, a time of division and discord, coming together to have these types of discussions is an imperative to our democracy. We thank everyone tuning in and to our brilliant panel for taking part in Faces of Change. We know you have choices with your time, and we're thrilled that you chose to spend your time with us. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce my sister, Maria Cardona, who will serve as host for this important conversation. Maria has more than 2 decades of experience in community affairs, government, politics, and public relations arenas. She is an advocate for some of the major issues affecting Latino communities, such as comprehensive immigration reform, voting rights protection, and access to affordable health care. Maria is a principal at Dewey Square Group and founder of Latinovations, and currently serves as a CNN en Español political commentator, and is also host of the eponymous Maria Show on El Rey Network. And you need to check that show out because Maria is on fire, especially with the elections just around the corner. She's actually calling from Atlanta, where she's going to be live from the vice presidential debates. And yes, she'll be wearing a mask, which I'm sure will be as stylish as everything else she wears. So let me make this clear. Maria is a real one, la mera verdadera. Please welcome Maria Cardona.
Thank you, hermano Tony. That was an incredible, lovely introduction. I love you for that and for everything else that you do. Your commitment to the Latino community, your commitment to lifting everybody up is such an incredible quality that we need now more than ever before. So gracias, hermano. I love you. It is such a pleasure to be with Ayuda and the Hispanic Heritage Foundation this evening. I'm so honored to serve as host of the first Faces of Change conversation. I'd like to add that today's programming is designed to inform and educate without engaging in political campaigning or partisan activity beyond Ayuda's mission. There will be plenty of time for that. Today's first installment of Ayuda's Faces of Change speaker series, we're going to take a look at some of the pressing issues facing our Latino, Afro-Latino, Indigenous, and immigrant communities. We will focus on the importance of the upcoming election for sure, and what is at stake, what it means for these communities, and we're going to explore the intersection between the Black Lives Matter movement and the immigrant rights movement, and how we can work to dismantle some of that racial inequality. Joining me this evening, we have an amazing panel of leaders in our community, including Cristian Ramos, a small business owner, a public speaker, a consultant in Washington, D.C., and a fellow political commentator. Juanita Cabrera Lopez, Executive Director of the International Mayan League, and Marco Davis, President and CEO of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute. So thank you, hermanos y hermanas, for joining us tonight for this important conversation. This is an issue, all of the issues that we're going to talk about tonight, I am committed to personally, and hit me personally as a mother of 2 Latino children. These issues have been at the front and foremost pivotal conversations for my family, and I know for so many other Latino families out there for many years, but more so today than ever before, because we see the country more divided than ever. We see some of our communities more devastated than ever because of what's going on with the pandemic and with the economy. And so this conversation comes at such a critical time, especially with all of the leaders, with you all, that deal with these issues front and center. So without further ado, let's get to it. I want to talk to you all about the impact of the upcoming elections and the importance of voting. We always hear that Latinos are going to be the sleeping giant that's finally going to wake up. And our numbers have increased year over year, but also because our community has grown year over year. We still have not hit the sweet spot of what our potential power could be if we are represented at the ballot box in what our numbers actually are in terms of our population and in terms of our eligible voters. We're going to be 32 million eligible voters in November, but less than half of that is what is expected or projected to come to the polls to vote. So hermanos and hermanas, we are leaving all of that power on the table. What can we do to make sure that we don't? So with the election less than a month away, let's talk about what is at stake. I'm going to start with you, Marco. What are you seeing with your members, with the members of the Hispanic caucus? What are you seeing from a legislative standpoint? What are you hearing in terms of what the members are hearing back home? And what are you hearing from your own fellows who are starting on their journeys professionally? How are they seeing the environment that we're seeing right now electorally?
Yeah, so first of all, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Ayuda. Thank you, Tony. It's a real pleasure to be here. And of course, with my fellow panelists, Juanita and Cristian, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Appreciate it. Maria, you just asked me about like 9 questions all in one, so I'm gonna give my best. I'm gonna do my best attempt to sort of wrap all those together, because I know we have limited time as well, because I could probably spend 20 minutes on each. What I would say is there's a couple of things at stake with this election, and for me, many of them can be sort of summarized in some ways around what is at stake at this election is nothing less than a decision about who we are as a nation and who we want to be going forward. I think right now, the overarching discussion and debate and argument is around what is the vision of our country? Is it one in which we are a diverse nation where all different populations and backgrounds and perspectives and experiences are recognized and accepted and included? Or is it one where we are feeling that there are forces in opposition and that we need to defend our own and to look out for ourselves and those closest to us versus others? And to me, as was said in the introduction, like to me, I'm not framing this I'm deliberately not framing this because I actually don't believe that this is actually a partisan debate or juxtaposition. This is really a more fundamental question around society, because I think arguably different people at different levels are presenting sort of different visions for the country and for communities. Because that's, and so finally, what I'll say, to give some time for my other panelists, what I'll say is that also what's important is that, for example, for me, I've realized it's really important to emphasize with everyone, frankly, with the Hispanic community, but frankly with everyone, for example, that this is not an election. There isn't actually one election. There may be one that's being talked about more than all others. The presidential takes up a lot of the oxygen. But frankly, there are elections happening throughout the country, at the Senate level, at the congressional level, at the state level, at the local level. There are mayors up for election. There are city council members and school board members up for election. And so fundamentally for me, what's at stake, to your point, for our community is asserting our voice, is leveraging that power, so that, in my mind, one of the most fundamental things that we believe, and part of the reason the members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, among others, are doing so much work this election cycle, is to raise up the voices of our community, whether that be as candidates or as voters, to recognize that we need to make sure our perspective, our concerns, our interests are taken into consideration, both in terms of how we decide who we support, but also how the folks who are ultimately victorious in these elections make decisions about where our country needs to go. If we assert ourselves and demonstrate that we have interests as a community, as a population, and that we have concerns that arguably are not that different from the rest of the United States, we care about good health care, access to a job, a strong education, personal safety, a roof over our heads, etc. If we can assert our presence in those conversations, then when the decisions are made after the election, our population will be taken into consideration. And that, for me, is what's most important.
Thank you. Thank you, Marco. On that note, let me turn to Christian. You know, we always talk about how campaigns and the committees and the candidates need to be doing much more to reach out to the Latino community. And I always think that that's the case, right? No matter how much they do. As a Latina, I just want them to put everything into our community. But what responsibility lies in our hands, Christian? What power do we have to say, you know what, I'm not going to wait to be wooed, to be reached out to, because this is too important to leave it in somebody else's hands, right? What responsibility do we have for us ourselves to try to motivate our own community to understand what's at stake in this election, and especially the Latino and the Afro-Latino community?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I'm going to reframe it slightly and say that what's at stake this election is our country, everything that Marco referenced, but I would add something else. It's our friends, our families, our neighbors, our communities. On a very basic level, Latinos are strong, resilient, and tough, but we're having a hard time out there right now. Nobody's asking for a handout. Nobody's asking for anything like that, but we need our government to work for us. We cannot live with such record high levels of unemployment. We cannot live with a pandemic that is hurting our community the way that it is. And to answer your question specifically, Maria, our community knows that, and they want to fight back. They want to take back their country. They want to stop living in fear. They want to stop living in a country which sometimes doesn't necessarily value them, right? The stuff that you hear coming from our government doesn't feel good. They want to feel safe again. To that end, it is our responsibility to take it upon ourselves, to look our neighbor in the eye, to look our mother in the eye, to look our father, and everybody that we know around us and say, if you want to change what is happening in America, go vote. And if you don't know how to vote, I'm going to help you vote. I'm going to help you fill out this form. I'm going to help you get ready to do everything that you can, whether it's early, whether it's by mail, whether it's on that day. You and I together are going to make this country better. And that's a good thing, right? That is a good thing, because I see a lot of not great things coming from our government right now. but I also see a lot of things that give me a lot of hope. I see people helping each other. I see people out there protesting in the street for our democracy. And that gives me hope for our country, because I ultimately believe that there are more good people out there. There are more people who care about this country, who are inspired and want to change the course of our country that we're on right now.
Mm-hmm.
So to answer your question, Maria, it is our responsibility. I'm not looking for anybody to help us. We're going to do this together right now, and we're going to take our country back.
Great. Juanita, I want to turn to you. What about the indigenous communities across the United States who have historically been neglected or left out when it comes to election and voting, and especially voting rights? What are the pressing issues you are seeing arise in these communities, and how can we all help to make sure that the indigenous community's vote is counted along with everybody else's?
First of all, thank you so much for being invited to speak on this panel with panelists in Ayuda and Hispanic Heritage Foundation. Also acknowledging the lands that we're on here in DC, which is Piscataway Nation territory, as we're talking about indigenous peoples and indigenous peoples' rights. It's also important to acknowledge the ancestral lands that we are on. I wanted to take this question more of a lens from indigenous peoples of the diaspora who have been displaced from their countries of origin. And what we have been seeing, not just this election cycle, but for decades, especially for indigenous peoples and the historical displacement that we have faced. When it comes to this country and elections and administrations, we have to look at impacts at all levels. We're looking at local, national, and international, because foreign policies of this country have consequences in terms of how they impact our human rights, our environmental rights, our economic rights in our countries of origins, which are oftentimes the root drivers of forced migration for many of us who are here, disproportionately impacting indigenous peoples and Afro-Latino peoples, who are some of the most marginalized communities in Latin America through colonization, racism, discrimination for more than 500 years. Many of the communities that we work with in our organization do not have the ability to vote because of the status that they have and other reasons. So when we talk about this election and its impact to our communities, again, it goes back to how do the policies and programs and direction of any administration, as we've seen from the 1980s when I came here as a political refugee, to the current family separation policies that have affected our families, the unaccompanied minors, the third safe country agreement. All of those have impacts to peoples, to individuals, to communities, and never mind the terrorism that we have lived under proposed raids under this administration, where the criminalization of our families and our communities have been elevated. And so really what we're seeing is that the situations in our communities, we're going to be some of the most impacted and the least likely to be able to assert some voice in this process. And so going back to Marco's point in the beginning, it's about bringing the issues to the table in a way where all voices can be heard. But when these voices, our voices, have been historically marginalized and neglected, the question then becomes, how do we become a process where our fundamental human rights are advocated for by people in our communities and in our alliances who can stand with us in solidarity and elevate our needs and rights?
Great, thank you. I want to now turn to the issue of the Black Lives Matter movement and the immigrant rights movement, and where there are a lot of similarities, where do they detract from each other, if in fact they do. This past year, we've seen the public rise up in the face of racial errors in a way that I have never seen before. corporations, communities all across the country, no matter what color, have gone to the streets and have changed their policies and focused on making sure that there are equities and equalities, again, in a way that I have not seen that kind of consciousness up until now. I'm going to turn this over to Christian first, and then Marco and Juanita. Can you speak to the intersection of what that looks like, the Black Lives Matter movement, the immigrants' rights movement, and why it's important to find those similarities, and what do we need to be careful about? Christian, I'll start with you.
So I'll start with what's working. I think right now in this country, people are very aware of the intersection of Black Lives Matter and the Immigrant Rights Coalition and the groups that are working on the ground. I think there is, within the grassroots movement, energy and a real appetite to tackle this movement, these issues in a very intersectional way. And I think it's quite powerful and it's palpable. And I'm just glad to be alive to see it in my lifetime. I think where we have to really be careful is one size doesn't fit all in how you talk about this with the Latino community versus how you talk about it within the Black community. And I think one thing that I am very cognizant of is you have to do the work and you have to really go in with culturally relevant ways of talking about this to each of these different groups, right? It's not guaranteed that one group will necessarily see it through the same lens as the other group. And that's okay. That is normal. That is how it is in the real world. And so I think being cognizant of that,
Right.
being aware and thoughtful about how you approach these conversations within each of these communities is critically important. But on the whole, I think there is a lot of work to be done and an appetite for it like we've never seen before.
Marco, let me turn to you to focus on this issue generally, but also, as you know, we have had to deal with some anti-Blackness, some racism, frankly, within the immigrant rights movement, within the Latino community. There's been a lot written about it recently. Historically, it's been something that I don't think we have wanted to talk about, but as all things racial, we have to have these hard discussions in order to get to a point where we can all come together. What do you think has been good about this discussion and what has been lacking?
Yeah, so first, I think it's important to contextualize. I want to follow up on what Christian said just now about some of the commonalities of the two movements, and then I think I want to tackle that piece because it'll help sort of paint some pictures. First off, I think one of the things I think that the two movements have in common is that they are a reaction, a response to what is sometimes referred to as sort of and it's to put it mildly, sort of a fundamental sort of othering of specific populations, and more specifically, a dehumanization of these two populations, right? And the movements, or rather, I should say, the treatment of the two populations is very different and plays out in very different ways in society and so on. But the underlying piece is, in my belief, a fundamental racism, a fundamental bias, a fundamental prejudice about these two populations, which is not just a dislike, although that is very present, but in fact, a formal codification and a policy implementation of rules and processes that serve to dehumanize, that serve to inflict harm, frankly, on these two populations, whether it's separating families, putting children in cages, deporting people forcibly, so exposing them to disease, incarcerating, and in fact, murdering through state-sanctioned violence, these populations, right? And so people are starting to realize that that is some of the commonalities, that they're both fighting a fundamental kind of prejudice idea that underlies the way those two areas play out. So that's one piece that's important, that's useful, that folks are starting to sort of see the commonality or the solidarity, shall we say, among the two movements. In addition to that, Christian mentioned, a few of us have mentioned, the intersectionality component, which leads to your point. The other thing that's happening right now, as people are awakened to these efforts and to these movements, and as people are engaging and getting into profound, deep conversations around them, we're also starting to realize, first of all, that in the Black population that's referenced from Black Lives Matter, there are Afro-Latinos who identify both in the Latino community, like myself, and in the African-American community. And that is a fundamental piece of which it's not either or, it's not one or the other, but it actually is fundamentally both. Similarly, the immigrant rights movement is one that has been championed in some ways by the Latino community and reflects very much the Latino community. But it's important also to note that immigrants in the United States are not exclusively Latino. And there are, in fact, members of the Black diaspora, not just Afro-Latinos, in fact, but in fact, Africans and West Indians and so on, who are immigrants to the United States and who are caught up in our broken immigration system and who are often targeted just as much for immigration status as other populations are, right? And so that intersectionality, that overlap is something to play out. Now, with all that said, that's the hopeful part, as Christian said, and that's the piece that I believe is some of the strengths that exist and some of the commonalities and the common ground that can be forged among these two movements that can continue to build collaboration, partnership, and mutual support. With that said, as people are having these deeper conversations, and again, I think because of the really honest and transparent conversations we've come to have as a nation around racism, after seeing this incredible brutality and murder of George Floyd and Breonna Stewart and realizing that those are just two and that there's so many more names, we've also come to have some really honest conversations with ourselves. And as a result of that, we've come to realize that within the Latino community, for probably ever, there has been a pernicious racism and an anti-Blackness that exists. Now, on the thing I will say about that is, on the one hand, we are finally coming to terms with it. We're finally coming face to face with it and acknowledging it and seeking to interrupt it, right? And to not perpetuate it any longer. And folks are speaking up, thankfully, not just Afro-Latinos ourselves, but many others in the Latino community, those who would be described as non-Black Latinos, who are speaking up and saying this is not acceptable in our community. So on the one hand, thankfully, again, we're acknowledging it, we're realizing it, we're no longer allowing it to continue. On the other hand, the one thing I say is it's also important to notice and to contextualize it in the bigger picture of things, to realize that part of it may not be all of the reason, but at least one part of the reason it exists is because the Latino community, like the white community, like arguably even the Black community, we are all infected by the virus, which has reached pandemic levels long before this year. That is racism in the United States. That is the white supremacy structure. And so in many ways, we've been fed and we've been allowed to feed, and in many ways, it actually extends beyond the US and goes back to colonialism, right? And to eras throughout the Americas where, again, that anti-Blackness and that racial categorization played out differently than in the US, but no less, but it was no less present, that has fed into that. And so that's part of the reasons why we need to recognize that while we work at it, we're also on this journey and facing this struggle, much like other populations and other communities in the United States. And hopefully that's something that will allow us, because one of the things I've seen as a reaction is that people have we've been very hard on ourselves as a community when we've become honest and discovered of sorts or spoken up about the fact that the racism exists in the Latino community. The racism exists everywhere. And that's important to remember, right? That we're trying to fight something that is in the air, that is all around us and has affected everyone.
Right. I want to come back to this issue, but before I do, I want to go to Juanita and get her take. Juanita, as an Indigenous woman of the Hmong people, can you speak to us about the Indigenous rights movement? And how can allies from the Latino and other communities acknowledge your Indigenous identity and existence? Advance our particular human rights together so that we are all fortified by it. Uh-oh, did I freeze?
Yeah, I didn't quite hear the last part of the question.
Okay, yeah, let me take on the Indigenous rights movement and how can allies from the Latino community and other communities of color acknowledge their identity and existence, and also help all of us.
Okay. But before answering that question, I wanted to dovetail on a couple of comments that that Marco said previously that I completely agree with. So first, I want to say Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty are some of the key ways that we need to work moving forward. I also want to acknowledge that for Black people that now are in the United States, we cannot disregard the history of slavery and of human trafficking that occurred 400 years ago. 500 plus years ago, we're looking at levels of genocide against Indigenous peoples. Coupled with that, we have the imposition of nation states that were created, imposed over our lands, our bodies, our peoples, through theft, through genocide, and through colonization. So what we're seeing now today, whether it's the United States, Guatemala, countries in what is now considered Latin America, are structures that were created, laws, policies, economies, religions that were created to advance a specific elite mindset that was Western based, that was brought in from Europe. And so what we see now are legacies of colonization, where we talked about the hierarchy of where we stand. I think the Latino community that we now see today, oftentimes, we don't acknowledge that within the Latino community, there has been a history of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous. Again, going back to categorization and labels and how we were and continue to be portrayed. And so those do have effects in terms of how we live the structural inequalities that are ingrained in society today. So how do we work together within that framework where there is historical marginalization to specific groups? We find the commonalities of working together. One of the ways that we have seen that work is by working with young people. I think young people right now are at a moment where there's a lot of questioning of history, of narrative, of imposition of frameworks, and then of proposing new ways forward, and really questioning why there's a structural racism in the way that it is today, but then also looking at how we can bridge those movements together. We do need to acknowledge that the racism that we see is not just white supremacy, but there is racism in different levels throughout our cultures and communities. And acknowledging that, acknowledging history and not just the Eurocentric framework that it's being portrayed, but really delving into the real history. And then never mind that we haven't even discussed the history of tribes and nations from this country and how they are being impacted by immigration, the border wall imposed on their sacred lands and territories. And so I think not having everything separated by groups, by saying the Black Lives Matter movement, the Latino community, I do agree that then puts people in different, it separates and says that the immigrant community cannot be Black. And we have oftentimes found that some of our greatest allies, when we talk about making visible those who are in plain sight, for instance, Indigenous peoples in the diaspora, we found great allies with people from Senegal, for instance, who talk about their stories of migration. So I think it's really addressing racism in our community, not just in a way that at lip service, but in a real concrete way that looking at our own organizations, restructuring who we are, our members, our allies, diversifying who we are, And then in the case of Indigenous peoples, it's also acknowledging that for many of us, we actually don't consider ourselves Latino, Hispanic, or Latinx because our communities existed here before the imposition of Eurocentric frameworks and nation states, which is where those terms were created. And so for many of us in our community, we say we're Indigenous, we're Native American, we're original peoples. And so having that understanding as well would help us in achieving our human rights and understanding the particular context that we come from, but also understanding how we can bridge movements together to advance human rights for everybody.
Thank you, Juanita. I want to bring up this Telemundo study that was brought up in the chat, and I think it's a great study to sort of jump off in terms of another discussion point. The study said that 85% of Latino youth is motivated to vote because of the social justice issues that were brought up by the Black Lives Matter movement. And so my question to all of the panelists, and you should take this through the lens of what you have been focusing on and the fight in the communities that you work mostly in. I think that the youth overall, and especially Latino youth and youth in the multicultural communities, are going to be what is the hope for this country, because they really don't see racial lines the way that old do, even generation X, my generation do, and you know, generations that are even older than us. And so I think that it is a real opportunity to move beyond what we have seen as these racial lines that have caused so much of the racial animus between our communities. And so I wanted to see if you all agree with that, number one. And then number two, when several white Latinos brought up the issue of racism amongst the Latino community, they got slammed for being the ones to bring this up because they had a platform. And a lot of people believe that it should have been Black Latinos to bring up this issue because they have lived it. And so in my mind, it's, and again, I want you guys to tell me if you guys think I'm right or I'm wrong, because this is how we have to fix this, right? And having these delicate conversations, but also, you know, not being shy about bringing something up and learning from others if that perspective is perhaps not the right one. And so in mind, I think it's okay for anybody to bring up the issue that needs to be dealt with as long as they are honest about it. And so to be clear, the person who wrote this piece, and it was in the New York Times, was Jorge Ramos. And as we all know, Jorge Ramos is a white Mexican who has a huge platform. And he brought up the issue of racism in the Latino community and how it had to be dealt with and how it had to be confronted and how it was a huge problem. People slammed the New York Times for giving Jorge that issue to speak about, as opposed to a Black Latino or a Black Latina who also had platforms, but you know, perhaps weren't as influential as Jorge, or whose followers weren't as many as Jorge. And so I want to kind of put that out there because I thought it was such an interesting discussion, and it was a lot. It got people's emotions up a lot more than I thought it would. So anyway, I'm going to open it up. Christian, let's start with you, since I know you're shy and have no opinions.
No. So I've actually done quite a bit of work in on this space recently, up until the election. And there has been a lot of really incredible research done by this group called Way to Win, Torre Gavito, with Ian Haney Lopez, who is a professor out of Berkeley. And they've done a lot of polling on this with Latino, white, and African-American voters. And the results were actually really surprising. Latinos and African-Americans, there were a lot of them who actually liked the message that was coming out of Donald Trump about racism and protection and so on and so forth. And there were quite a few. It was a popular view. And what they also found was that the way that progressives talk about racism turned off a lot of Latinos. Latinos did not like the way that progressives talk about racism. And what they found in the polling was progressives deal with race in two ways, one of two ways. It's colorblind, right? We don't see race at all within the population in the country. Race doesn't exist, and everybody's the same. That's one way that progressives deal with it. And then the other way that progressives generally deal with racism is they have a call-out culture. They call out racism when they see it, and they've got to fight it, and they're going to end it. Well, on the first one, the colorblind thing does really well with white people, and it doesn't do great with Latinos and African Americans because they're very keenly aware of their race. Right. The other one, the call-out culture, does very well with African American voters. It does terribly with Latinos and white voters. And the reason it does so badly with with Latino voters is a lot of Latino voters consider themselves white. And when you're talking about racism in America, it's always a problem within the white community, and they feel that they themselves are being attacked. And a lot of people are often like very shocked, about this. Like, how can Latinos consider themselves white or consider themselves anything else? But Maria, you're from Colombia, right? Just like somebody's from Argentina or some of the other places. Everybody in Colombia is white. They don't consider themselves indigenous or Latino. I mean, some do. Some do.
Yeah. I mean, the coast, you have a lot of Afro-Latinos on the coast of Colombia.
Or Argentina or Mexico, right? A lot of Mexicans, like you were just saying. And so they come to the United States and they still consider themselves white. And so there is this thing within the Latino community where they're like, no, that's not great. So I want to wrap up here because I don't want to spend up too much time on this. But what we found is when you talk about class and race together, people like to hear that. When you say, well, actually, racism is a problem, and the person that is exploiting that problem is Donald Trump and is these wealthy elites who are using it to divide us so that they can get tax cuts for the wealthy and everybody else, Latinos, African Americans, and white voters all like to hear that. That's the message that works the best if you're trying to reach these voters and to talk about this issue. And so you can acknowledge racism, but then you also have to acknowledge that it is a tool and is used by elites to divide our country.
That is fascinating, Christian. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Your thoughts on this easy question?
To me, it's just a reminder of how much work we have to do. I think fundamentally, I think that obviously I don't question those surveys. I think that people are responding honestly. I think what that illustrates to me is exactly how undeveloped the conversation around race is among many populations.
Good way to put it. Yeah.
It illustrates to me how little prior to now folks have talked about race and racism. I would argue that negative response might be, since I don't know people's motivations, right? But I could understand that negative response to the progressive argument around racism. I could see that being attributed to discomfort, right? Because that I've had many conversations with many white people who've said, talking about race makes me uncomfortable. And one of the reasons when I've worked with folks and they've unpacked that, it makes them uncomfortable because they've not talked about it before, because they know that somewhere in a distant world, it's a terrible thing, but that if they get too close to it, they're gonna get the electric shock, right? That's why they call these things third rails, because they're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing. They're right. And there's all that kind of baggage tied up in it. And again, to me, this is illustrative of the fact that like the racism we've been talking about in American society, Latinos and to use the term as the way Christian talked about it, that it seems some folks who self-identify as white who are Latino, in my mind, they're infected by the same racism that non-Latino white folks are, in the sense of that race and racism is an uncomfortable topic. They seem to perceive the idea that saying that racism bad somehow means it's a white problem. I would argue it's an everyone problem.
An everyone problem.
It's not something that is exclusive to white people. Racism affects and impacts and harms all of us. It actually harms white people as well as black people in different ways, right? I'm not saying the treatment is the same, but that it is something that, right? And so for me, like, that is what I take away from that, from my understanding of that phenomenon, right? Is that we need, like, if anything, for me, that means we need to be talking about race even more. And maybe we need to find other ways to introduce the subject, as Christian was saying, maybe tying it to class, getting people more comfortable with the concept, understanding what we're really talking about, with few exceptions, with few very, very visible exceptions. In most other cases, we're not saying you are a bad person, you are right. There are some bad people and there are some terrible racists, but many, many people we're talking about are not awful people, but they, again, have been infected and affected by the racism that permeates our society. And some of their ideas and perspectives and opinions have been shaped by the racism that exists all around us. Their opinions of Black people have been informed by societal messages from either the day they were born or the day they arrived in the United States, that they've been told specific messages about Black people, which have been overwhelmingly negative. And so, of course, they're like, I'm not racist, I just think this. And it's like, well, yeah, you've been told that for so long. And you've not been able, you've not heard anything else. Right. And so again, it's not that you're a bad person. It's that but you've got to understand that you've been told that message. You've been fed lies, frankly. Right. So for me, that's the piece. And the last thing I'll say, since you mentioned it, to bridge, is my personal opinion. I can see how there's lots of perspectives and opinions and desires, but I, for one, am of the opinion that, in fact, as illustrated by the last point, I believe there is absolutely still a dramatic need for more conversations about race. And for me, that means as many people as humanly possible need to be talking about race and racism, and therefore, in my mind, Jorge Ramos talking about race is okay. I understand the point about that. Maybe the New York Times, like, in my mind, the New York Times, another thing, and I don't know if people suggested this, but in my mind, the New York Times could have run the Jorge Ramos piece, which many people would read because it's Jorge Ramos. And maybe the New York Times should not just run one op-ed on racism in the Latino community by Jorge Ramos, but could actually do a couple more that include some Afro-Latinos too, right? It's not like that was your one shot and therefore you blew it. Actually, I feel like there should be a piece every day, frankly, about things like that.
Exactly. I think that's exactly the answer. Yeah, I think you're right. And, you know, and the attacks weren't geared toward Jorge Ramos, right? They were toward the New York Times for exactly what you were bringing up. And so I think that goes to how the only way that we're going to get to the bottom of this is by including everybody's perspective. So, Juanita, what do you say to all of this from the perspective of the Indigenous community?
So, well, I don't speak for all Indigenous peoples, but I'll speak from our organization.
Sure.
I think, as has already been discussed, I think that study really, again, illustrates that the conversation is nascent and that we really have to pick up a mirror and look at our communities and really start to have a conversation of where does that racism start and stop, or has it ever stopped within our communities? And I think, you know, some of the blanket statements, like if we look at some of the countries that were mentioned, Colombia, Argentina, who I have often heard people say, well, we don't have any Indigenous people here because we killed them all. And so you hear people saying that in a prideful way, which again highlights the historical context of what I wanted to talk about, which I mentioned before, is that legacy has real consequences. And actually, Indigenous peoples exist in every country in Latin America, as do Afro-descendant people in every country of Latin America. The problem is that we don't acknowledge that that's a part of the history, the landscape. And then we, you know, there are a lot of people I know who claim that they are white. And if you look at them, you would say you're not white. But there's a lot of internal racism as well that we have brought in from survival mechanisms, for instance, with Indigenous peoples. And I look at Guatemala and the genocide that we've had in my lifetime. People were targeted because they were Maya. People were systematically killed by the government because they were Maya. So it was a survival mode to deny your identity. And so as we come now to the United States, many indigenous peoples continue to hide their identity because of racism, because of discrimination, or because of survival mechanism. Going back to the original question, which was when people who are white bring up racism in a space, is that the right way? Well, I think it's an opening door, but I think that anybody who has leverage, who has power, who has privilege, should be able to open a space for those who are least heard, who are most affected and most impacted, to speak for themselves. Because the problem is that in our communities, we're often thought of that we don't know the answers for our communities, that we can't speak for ourselves, or we don't know what's good for us. And so the more that we can have allies help open and bridge those spaces to have directly affected people to come and speak from our experiences, and also from grassroots driven solutions, you know, create more op-eds or video series or other ways that are engaging, especially with the youth population, because I do really have a lot of hope for young people and the conversations that I'm seeing on Twitter, on Instagram, where they're acknowledging what's occurring. There's concern, not just with race, but also the environment. And you can't separate those two either when you talk about environmental racism and the most affected communities right now. And that's a whole nother conversation, but the young people are very aware of what's happening in their communities because they're living it. That's their life every day. And so I think sometimes for us older people, we also need to catch up with what's happening in the younger circles, and also be able to provide some historical reference to help maybe bridge some of those historical gaps, but also understand that young people are doing some really excellent work as well.
Juanita, thank you so much. I think that was a great way to wrap it up, frankly, and also open it up to, I think we could have 3 or 4 more hours of this conversation, because you talked about environmental racism, and you're absolutely right. You can't separate the two. You know, the other thing we can't separate really is racism when it comes to healthcare access. We're seeing it with COVID-19 and how it has devastated communities of color much more so than white communities. And that is based on inequalities, on inequities in the healthcare system that goes back to racism. And so racism is, in effect, like Marco said, the original pandemic that affects everything else. Anyway, we are out of time. I want to thank our panelists for a fabulous conversation. And we, again, could be talking about these issues for many, many more hours. This was super enlightening. You guys have been working on these things front and center, and you really educated everyone who is watching this and hearing this, including myself. And I want to turn it over to Paula Fitzgerald, the Executive Director of Ayuda, and someone who has been and continues to be on the front lines of all of the issues that we are talking about as an advocate for immigrants and for women who suffer from domestic violence, on so many other issues. Paula, I really want to thank you for giving us the opportunity to have this space to talk about all of these important issues. And I was honored to be the moderator of this incredible discussion tonight. So Paula, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you this evening for our first installment in Faces of Change. This was a wonderful discussion, and I learned a lot from all of you. I'd like to thank you, Maria, too, and Christian, Juanita, and Marco as well for speaking tonight. It was extremely compelling conversation, and like you said, it could probably go on for 3 hours or more. And the speaker series will go on, so hopefully we'll unpack a little more as we move along on that. As a Latino, as a daughter of an immigrant mother, as an immigrant rights activist, I really agree with you all that these conversations are so important to be had. And I'm thrilled at our number of attendees and the interest in these topics. We're in a time of such deep division, and we need to continue raising awareness on the issues facing our Hispanic, Latinx, Afro-Latinx, Indigenous, and immigrant communities. And we have to help elevate the voices of those who have been most marginalized, and also take meaningful action to address the issue of racial inequality that we were speaking about. So thank you all. On behalf of Ayuda, we really appreciate the contributions of all of you, and also specifically the Hispanic Heritage Foundation and Immigrant Food. Thanks to all the staff at the Hispanic Heritage Foundation for your work in inspiring, preparing, and positioning Latino leaders in the classroom, community, and workforce. And a special thanks to Tony for your commitment in serving the immigrant community Ayuda serves through your service as an Ayuda Advisory Council member. We love you. We're so grateful for you. And also thanks to our corporate partner, Immigrant Food, for your commitment to providing a space for advocacy, change, and community. Together, we can all unite around the table and have more conversations such as this one. And again, thank you to all the attendees who are online watching. We know this is a time where there's so many competing professional and personal priorities, and we are really grateful that you are here with us today. Like many organizations, Ayuda was faced with the question of how to engage and share our mission at a time when we couldn't convene everyone in person. So we're very excited about this Faces of Change series. And we're looking forward to offering conversations regarding current topics and events that are important to our mission. And now more than ever, we're just thrilled to have this space to discuss these important topics. And so thank you all. We're going to continue to fight, as are you all. And we hope that everyone will take their fight to the ballot box to renew your commitment to upholding the dignity, rights, and well-being of our immigrant neighbors. And please save the date, November 19th, for our next installment of Faces of Change. Thank you all. Have a great evening.